The cursor blinked on the screen, rhythmically mocking the number. $300. That was the entire sum remaining in the account. Olivia Bennett leaned back, the plastic chair creaking in the stillness of the apartment. Outside, the city moved, but inside, the only sound was the low, persistent hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. She stared until the numbers blurred. This was the wall. There was no more credit, no more savings, and no more room for error. She closed the laptop with a sharp click, effectively silencing the digital reminder of her failure. She stood up, legs stiff, and walked into the kitchen. The table was buried under a stack of overdue notices. The paper edges curled and yellowed. She swept the pile into a single, jagged stack and shoved them aside to clear a workspace. She pulled a notebook from the counter, the spine cracking as she forced it flat. She picked up a pen, the plastic cold against her fingers, and pressed the tip into the paper. She wrote one word in heavy, deliberate strokes: service. The silence in the room shifted. It was no longer the silence of stagnation. It was the quiet of a starting line. The next morning, the sun hit the table, exposing the dust motes dancing in the air. Olivia opened the laptop again. Her finger hovered over the enter key. $200. That was the cost of the web domain and the professional design software. She clicked. The progress bar crawled across the screen, a slow, agonizing crawl that drained her account to its final $100. She watched the confirmation email appear. It felt like burning a bridge while still standing on it. She looked at the remaining balance. $100. That was for groceries, for survival, for the next few weeks of existence. She pushed the laptop away and walked to the kitchen window. The street below was indifferent. She had paid for the tools, but she had bought herself a deadline. There was no safety net left. She looked at the notebook on the table, the words service staring back at her. Her hands were steady now, but her stomach tightened. She had invested everything into the possibility of a future. Now, she had to force that future to pay for her next meal. The phone felt like a lead weight. She dialed the first number, her throat tight, her voice cracking as she stumbled through the pitch. The line went dead. She dialed again, another rejection, then a third, a fourth, and a fifth. By the 10th call, the rejection was a rhythmic beat in her ears. She ignored the hunger gnawing at her stomach and kept the rhythm going, hour after hour. The sun rose and set, and the apartment grew stagnant with the smell of stale coffee. Her knuckles were white from gripping the receiver. She recorded her hits and misses on a legal pad, the ink smears growing as the pile of notes mounted. 17 calls, 18, 19. Her voice was raw, rasping against the quiet of the room. She dialed the 20th number, her fingers shaking, fully expecting the familiar click of a hang-up. Instead, a voice answered. It was a local bakery owner. She stayed on the line, kept her tone steady, and laid out the offer. The owner asked a question, then another. She answered both with a precision she did not know she possessed. The meeting was set for the following morning. She hung up the phone and the silence returned, but the desperation in her chest had been replaced by a singular, sharp focus. The bakery smelled of yeast and burnt sugar, a sharp contrast to the sterile quiet of her apartment. Olivia pushed through the door, the bell chiming a thin, lonely note. She walked to the counter, her palms damp against the paper edges of her proposal. The floorboards creaked under her weight. She slid the document across the glass, her hands trembling as she pointed toward the graphs. The owner did not look at the pages. He wiped his hands on a towel, his eyes fixed on the street outside. He sighed, a slow, heavy sound that seemed to deflate the entire room. "I do not have a budget for marketing," he said. His voice was flat, final, and entirely unimpressed. Olivia watched his face, waiting for a flicker of interest, but there was only the steady, rhythmic ticking of a wall clock. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Every second of that quiet felt like the walls of the shop were closing in on her. She had poured every remaining cent and 72 hours of her life into this single document. Now, as the owner turned his back to attend to a tray of bread, the reality of the rejection settled into her bones. Her dream was not just stalled, it was collapsing right there on the counter. Olivia did not step back. She did not lower her hands. Instead, she reached out and tapped the paper, her fingernail clicking sharply against the glass. "I am not asking for a budget," she said. Her voice steady despite the adrenaline spiking in her chest. I will manage your social media for 2 weeks for free. You see the results, or you owe me nothing." The owner paused, his hand halfway to the oven door. He looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since she entered. The shop seemed to hold its breath. She held his gaze, refusing to blink, refusing to let the fear show. She was betting everything on this. Every remaining dollar and every hour of her labor. The owner squinted at the proposal, then back at her. The silence returned, but it was no longer heavy with rejection. It was charged with the weight of a deal. He reached out, his hand calloused and dusted with flour, and gripped hers. The handshake was firm, a sudden, jolting connection that signaled the end of the uncertainty. He nodded once, sharp and decisive. 2 weeks. She had exactly 14 days to turn his business around or face total ruin. She let go of his hand, turned, and walked out of the bakery into the bright, unforgiving light of the street. The 2-week clock began the moment she reached her kitchen table. Olivia cleared the surface, leaving only her laptop and a single bowl of rice. She did not leave the apartment. She did not sleep for more than 4 hours a night. The hunger was a constant dull ache in her gut, but she ignored it, focusing instead on the glowing screen. 16 hours a day, she photographed every croissant and loaf, uploading content until her eyes burned. She lived on water and cheap rice, the grains dry and flavorless, but she barely tasted them. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with a frantic, rhythmic intensity. Every click was a calculation. She tracked engagement metrics like a lifeline, marking spikes and dips on a wall chart with a thick black pen. Her back cramped, her head throbbed, and the silence of the room became a heavy weight she had to push against just to stay upright. By the end of the first week, her hands shook when she held the camera, yet she adjusted the lens and kept shooting. She was not just building a campaign, she was fighting for her survival. Every pixel on the screen had to be perfect. Every post had to hit the target. If the numbers did not move, she did not eat. She stared at the data until the lines blurred into shapes, then forced them back into focus. The 14th day started with a sharp, pre-dawn alarm. Olivia walked to the bakery, her legs heavy, her stomach hollow from weeks of rationing. She turned the final corner of the block and stopped dead. A line stretched from the bakery door, winding around the brickwork of the next building. People stood in the morning air, waiting to get inside. She moved through the crowd, her heart hammering against her ribs. Inside, the bakery was a blur of motion. The owner was pulling trays from the oven, his face flushed with heat and surprise. He caught her eye over the counter, dropped a stack of receipts, and walked toward her. He did not say a word. He pulled a checkbook from his apron pocket, scribbled a figure, and ripped the paper free. He pressed the check into her hand. Her fingers closed around the paper, the texture of the check crisp and real against her skin. $500. She looked at the number, then back at the line of customers still waiting for their turn. The air in the shop felt different. It was no longer the smell of desperate work, but the scent of success. She tucked the check into her pocket, took a breath that finally filled her lungs, and walked out of the shop toward the bank. The cycle of survival had broken. The $500 cleared the teller counter and hit her account balance with a digital chime. That single check became a recurring contract, then 2, then 4. The workload grew until it exceeded the hours in a day. Olivia stood in her cramped living room, now transformed into a makeshift command center, and made a single call. 2 days later, a freelancer sat at her kitchen table, staring at a laptop. The silence of the apartment was replaced by the clatter of 2 keyboards. They worked in tandem, splitting the content calendars and the analytics. Revenue climbed. The space felt smaller by the hour. Olivia packed her gear into crates, the cardboard heavy and smelling of dust. She signed the lease for a shared office suite downtown. It was small, a glass-walled corner in a larger building, but it had a lock on the door and a dedicated desk. She carried her monitors inside and set them up, the cables snaking across the floor. She sat in the chair, adjusted the height, and looked out at the city skyline. The business was no longer a personal struggle. It was an entity, a machine that needed feeding. She opened her email, saw 3 new inquiries, and began the work of scaling. The boardroom was cold, the air thin and sterile. Opposite Olivia, the potential client drummed his fingers on the mahogany table, his eyes scanning her small team with open doubt. "Communer offering full scaling C results with a skeleton crew," he stated, his voice flat. He did not look impressed. He looked ready to walk out. Olivia did not blink. She stood up, the chair legs scraping against the floor, and moved to the center of the table. She pulled her tablet from her bag, the screen glowing in the dim light. With a single motion, she placed the device directly in front of him. She swiped to the growth charts. The lines were sharp, aggressive, and undeniably upward. She pointed to the cumulative engagement metrics from her first 3 clients. The client stopped drumming his fingers. He leaned in, his focus narrowing as he parsed the numbers. He looked at the tablet, then up at Olivia, then back at the screen. The silence in the room stretched until it became heavy. He reached into his coat, pulled out a pen, and pulled the contract toward him. He signed the bottom line, the scratching of the pen the only sound in the room. He pushed the papers back across the table. The deal was done. 5 years later, the city lights blurred into a steady stream of amber and white beyond the glass. Olivia sat in a chair that swiveled with frictionless precision, her office silent and expansive. She clicked a button. The financial statement appeared on her monitor, the final figure resting at 1 million. She did not linger on the number. She reached for her phone, opened the gallery, and tapped the oldest file. A screenshot of a $300 bank balance filled the screen. She looked at the 2 numbers, the past and the present, then swiped the image away. She set the device face down on the desk, the glass clicking against the wood. The transition was complete. She stood up, smoothing the front of her desk, and walked toward the door. She passed her secretary, pushed open the double doors of the conference room, and stepped into the light. Her team sat waiting, pens poised over notebooks. She reached the head of the table, placed her hands flat on the surface, and looked at the faces looking back at her. The next pitch was already forming in her mind. She inhaled, opened her mouth, and began to